The clock on the stove read 6:42 a.m. when I saw her. The sun was just a rumor behind the eastern ridges, a pale blush of primrose and violet against the deep indigo of the pre-dawn sky. I was standing at my kitchen sink, nursing my first cup of coffee, the steam warming my face in the cool air of the house. From my window, I have a clear view down the long gravel drive to the county road, and across the 5 acres of pasture that separate my small ranch house from the newer, more tightly packed homes of the meadows at Sagebrush Point. And there she was, a dark shape, moving with misplaced purpose on my land. Brenda Clark, president of the Homeowners Association. She was dressed in what I suppose she considered practical work attire: pristine khaki pants, a fleece vest over a crisp polo shirt, and boots that had never known a day of real mud. In her hands, she held a sledgehammer and a metal T-post driver. Beside her on the ground was a small pile of steel posts and a roll of barbed wire. She was standing precisely where the old informal access gate used to be, the one I had taken down and replaced with a permanent 5-strand fence just last week. She was preparing to tear down my new fence. I took a slow sip of coffee. It was black, strong, and hot. It grounded me. I watched as she positioned the first steel post, not on the old fence line, but a good 10 feet inside my property. She was attempting to carve out a new corridor, a new reality, by sheer force of will. She hefted the post driver, a heavy cylinder of steel with 2 handles, and slammed it down onto the post. The metallic clang echoed in the still morning air, a percussive declaration of war. It was a sound that made the birds in the old cottonwood go silent. I set my mug down on the counter, the ceramic making a soft click against the granite. I picked up my phone, unlocked it, and opened the camera application, EA. I hit record, making sure the timestamp in the corner of the video was clear. I didn't move from the window. I just stood there, documenting. She slammed the driver down again and again. The post sank into the dry earth, inch by painful inch. She was surprisingly strong for a woman who spent most of her days composing threatening newsletters about unapproved decorative flagstones. After she had driven the first post about a foot into the ground, she paused, breathing heavily, and looked up toward my house. She saw me then, a silhouette in the window. She smiled, a tight, triumphant little smile, and gave a small wave, as if we were partners in this endeavor. As if I should be grateful she was taking the time out of her busy schedule to vandalize my property. I did not wave back. I simply held the phone steady. Her smile faltered. She dropped the post driver and marched toward my house, her boots crunching on the gravel she didn't own. I walked out my front door and stood on the porch, my phone still recording, held loosely at my side. She stopped about 20 feet away, just past the bed of hardy desert marigolds my late wife Eleanor had planted. "Arthur," she called out, her voice sharp and carrying. "Good, you're up. I was hoping to get this done before it gets too hot. I'm reestablishing the historic access path. You had no right to block it." I remained silent. I let the quiet of the morning hang in the air between us. "Did you hear me?" she snapped, her performative neighborliness evaporating. "This is a designated equestrian easement. It's been used by the residents of the meadows for 10 years. You can't just close it off. I'm the president of the HOA, and I'm directing you to cease obstructing community access." She gestured back at my new fence with a grand sweep of her arm. "That fence is a violation. The board has already voted to issue a $1,000 fine, and we will be billing you for the cost of restoring the access way." I took another slow sip of my imaginary coffee, mimicking the motion from the kitchen. I wanted her to feel my calm. It was the thing that would unnerve her the most. "I have the authority to do this," she said, her voice rising. "I'll call the sheriff if I have to. I will have you arrested for endangerment. Our members need to be able to access the state lands for fire mitigation and recreation. You are putting this entire community at risk with your selfishness." I finally lowered my phone and looked her directly in the eye. I said nothing. My silence was a vacuum, and her nature, like all vacuums, abhorred it. She was compelled to fill it with more words, more threats, more on-the-record statements. "This is your final warning, Arthur. Take down the rest of that illegal fence or I will, and the fines will continue to accumulate. $10,000 a day if necessary. We can and we will put a lien on your property. We will foreclose. You will lose this house." She puffed out her chest. A little bantam rooster of a woman. She really believed it. She believed in her own power with a purity that was almost religious. I raised my phone again, made sure the red light was still blinking, and held it up so she could see it. I said my first and only words of the encounter. "Brenda Clark, president of the Meadows at Sagebrush Point Homeowners Association. I am recording this conversation. It is 6:49 a.m. on Tuesday, August 14th. You are standing on my property, APN number 72B-441-09, and you have just admitted to willfully damaging my fence and attempting to erect a new one without my consent. You have threatened me with illegal fines and foreclosure. Is that an accurate summary?" The color drained from her face. The bravado, the performance, it all collapsed in an instant. She stared at the phone, then at me. The tight smile was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed gape. She had been performing for an audience of one, and she had just realized her monologue was being entered into evidence. She stammered, You can't record me." "This is a single-party consent state, Brenda," I said, my voice even and low. "And you are on my property. I can record whatever I want." She turned without another word, scrambled back to her pile of fencing materials, grabbed her sledgehammer, and practically ran back toward the manicured lawns of the Meadows. She left the half-driven post and the roll of barbed wire right where they lay, monuments to her hubris. I watched her retreat until she was just a small, angry speck. I stopped the recording and saved the file. I went back inside, poured myself another cup of coffee, and sat down at my kitchen table. She had no idea. She had no idea of the hornet's nest she had just kicked. She thought she was dealing with a quiet old widower who kept to himself. She thought she was fighting over a fence. She had no idea that for the last 35 years, my entire professional life had been about documents, about ownership, about rules, and about liars. She had just threatened a man whose job it was to read the fine print on the bill of sale for a person's soul. She had no idea who she was dealing with, but before I tell you what I did next, I should probably explain. This wasn't about a fence. Not really. It was about a file folder. A very thick, very heavy manila file folder that lived in the bottom drawer of my desk. My name is Arthur Penhaligon. I'm 68 years old. I've lived on this small ranch, the last undeveloped parcel bordering the Meadows subdivision, for 40 years. My wife Eleanor and I bought it when this was all just open rangeland. We raised 2 kids here, a few dozen head of cattle every year, and a lifetime of memories. Eleanor passed away 3 years ago. The house has been quieter since then. The quiet is what I value most. For 35 of those 40 years, I worked for the state. My official title, the one on my retirement papers, is Senior Livestock Brand Inspector for the Department of Agriculture. It sounds quaint, I know. It sounds like something out of an old western. But it's a serious job. It's detective work. A brand on a cow or a horse isn't just a symbol. It's a legal title of ownership, registered with the state, as binding as the deed to a house. My job was to enforce that. I spent my life traveling the back roads of this county, checking bills of sale at auction yards, investigating reports of stolen cattle, and testifying in court against rustlers. Rustlers in the modern age don't always use a running iron and a fast horse. More often, they use a forged bill of sale, a fraudulent transport manifest, or a hacked database. My work was about the paper trail. It was about meticulously following a chain of custody, verifying signatures, checking notary logs, and spotting the one tiny inconsistency in a stack of documents that proved a lie. I was, for all intents and purposes, a forensic accountant for livestock. I learned to be patient. I learned that liars are always in a hurry, and I learned to keep receipts. On everything. When they started building the Meadows at Sagebrush Point, 15 years ago, we knew things would change. The developer was a slick operator from out of state. He put in a clubhouse, a pool, and a set of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC and Rs, that ran to 200 pages. He sold a lifestyle. He sold the idea of the West without any of the actual work or dirt. Eleanor and I read the documents. The developer had wanted an equestrian easement across the corner of our property to connect his subdivision to the state land beyond. We said no. We had our own small herd, and we didn't want the liability or the disruption. Our lawyer drew up a formal declination. But we were neighborly. We told the first few families who moved in, people we got to know, that if they wanted to ride across, they just had to call first. It was an informal kindness, a handshake agreement. For years it worked. People were respectful. Then, Brenda Clark moved in, about 8 years ago. She was a force of nature. Charismatic, energetic, and utterly convinced of her own righteousness. She saw the informal HOA, which had been a casual group for managing the pool chemicals and planning a yearly barbecue, and she saw a power vacuum. Within a year, she was president. Within 2, she had rewritten the bylaws, hired a management company, and turned the HOA into her own personal fiefdom. The file folder started small. It began with the first notice I received. A crisp, white envelope with the HOA's professionally designed logo. It was a warning, citing me for unauthorized agricultural activity visible from a member's property, my cattle, which had been grazing this land for 30 years before her house was even a blueprint. I read the CC and Rs again. My property was explicitly excluded. I was not a member of the HOA. They had no jurisdiction. I could have fought it. I could have sent a letter from my lawyer. But that would have been a direct confrontation, and I was still in the business of quiet observation. Instead, I filed the notice. Then, the notices started appearing on my neighbors' doors. Mr. Henderson, a retired school teacher in his 70s, got a $200 fine because his woodpile for his stove was not aesthetically uniform. The Patels got a warning for flying a Diwali flag during the festival. A young family was threatened with legal action because their children's chalk drawings on the sidewalk were an unapproved modification of a common area. Brenda's power was performative. At the monthly HOA meetings, which I never attended but heard about from weary neighbors, she would hold court. She would interpret the CC and RS not as a legal document, but as a sacred text to which only she had the key. The spirit of the community, she would say, demands that we maintain a certain standard. Her standard. If anyone questioned her, she would accuse them of being antisocial, of not caring about property values, of being selfish. Most people, busy with their lives, just paid the fines. They wanted peace. They didn't realize they were feeding the beast. I kept the receipts, not just my own. When Mr. Henderson told me about his woodpile fine, I asked for a copy of the letter. He gave it to me, bewildered. "What are you going to do, Arthur?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I told him. And it was the truth. I just knew that documentation was a form of potential energy. You store it up piece by piece until you have enough to move a mountain. Or, in this case, a petty tyrant. The folder grew thicker. It contained copies of fines, photos of non-existent violations, and printouts of angry emails Brenda had sent. The issue of the equestrian easement began about 2 years ago. Brenda, a self-proclaimed horsewoman, decided the informal access we had granted was insufficient. She began referring to it in the HOA newsletter as the Sagebrush Point Public Access Trail. She put up a little sign. I took it down. She put up another, this one was more official looking, with the HOA logo. I took that one down too, and sent her a polite, registered letter with a copy of the original plat map, and a reminder that there was no recorded easement. On paper, there was no trail. She ignored it. Worse, she escalated. She began encouraging all the HOA members to use the path. "It's our right," she told them. "Historic use establishes a prescriptive easement." She used legal-sounding words to give her desires the weight of law. She had no idea what a prescriptive easement actually entailed in this state. 20 years of uninterrupted, open, and hostile use. Our handshake agreement, our neighborly kindness, actually invalidated any such claim. Our permission freely given was the very thing that prevented her from claiming a right. The irony was beautiful, in a legalistic sort of way. The final straw was the gate. The old wire gate was falling apart. It was a hassle for me and for my cattle. I decided to build a permanent fence. It was an investment in my own peace and quiet. I hired a crew. We tore out the old posts and we put in a solid, 5-strand high-tensile barbed wire fence. It was a good fence, a proper fence. It followed the survey line exactly. When it was finished, I felt a sense of order restored. The boundary was clear. On paper and now on the land itself. Brenda saw the new fence not as a legitimate improvement to my property, but as a personal attack. A rebellion. She sent an email to the entire HOA. The hostile actions of the adjacent landowner, Mr. Arthur Penhaligon, it read, have illegally blocked our community's historic and vital access to state lands. The board is reviewing all legal options and will take decisive action to protect the rights and property values of our members. And that decisive action, apparently, was a 6:42 a.m. assault with a post driver. So there I was, sitting at my kitchen table, the video of her confession saved on my phone, and the weight of that thick manila folder in the desk drawer behind me. She thought this was a shouting match. She thought it was about who could be the most intimidating. She had no idea this was now a matter of paperwork, and I was a master of paperwork. I stood up, went to my desk, and pulled out the bottom drawer. The folder was right where I left it. I placed it on my desk. It made a satisfyingly solid sound. I opened it up. The first document on top was the notice about my cattle from 5 years ago. I smiled. It was time to get to work. My first step was not to call my lawyer. That would come later. My first step was to formalize my own position, to create a new layer of documentation, a fresh starting point from which all future actions would spring. I drafted a formal letter, not an angry one, not an emotional one, a procedural one. I addressed it to the Board of Directors, Meadows at Sagebrush Point Homeowners Association. Care of Brenda Clark, President. I used the official address listed on their state corporation filing. The letter was simple. It stated the facts, the date, the time, the names. It referenced the video I had taken. It formally notified them of the trespass and the attempted destruction of my property. It included a professionally prepared invoice for the removal of the abandoned fencing materials and the repair of the turf damage, a modest sum of $250. It also included a formal notice of no trespass, informing the entire board and, by extension, the entire HOA that any further entry onto my property by any agent or member of the HOA without my express written permission would be treated as criminal trespass and reported to the sheriff's department. I printed 3 copies, one for my file, one to be sent via certified mail, return receipt requested to the HOA's official address. The 3rd copy I decided to deliver by hand. I drove into town, not to the post office, but to a copy shop. I had them print a large format, high-resolution color photograph of the survey plat map of my property. The map was a public record, filed with the county recorder's office in 1978. It clearly showed my parcel, APN 72B-441-09, and the adjacent parcel that would become the Meadows. The property line was a thick, unambiguous black line. There was no mention of any easement. I then drove to the Meadows. I didn't go to Brenda's house. That would be a confrontation. I went to the community clubhouse where the official HOA bulletin board was located behind a locked glass case. Using a key I shouldn't have had, a master key for outdoor utility boxes, a relic from my days investigating rural thefts, I opened the case. I removed a flyer for a Wine and Watercolor Wednesday and pinned my letter, along with the color plat map, directly in the center of the board. I closed and locked the case. Now my warning was not a private dispute, it was a public notice. Every resident who came to get their mail would see it. They would see the map. They would see the clear, hard lines of ownership. They would see that Brenda's historic trail was a fiction. The certified letter was signed for 2 days later. The return receipt, a small green postcard with the signature of the HOA's management company agent, came back to me in the mail. I stapled it to my copy of the letter and placed it in the folder. The receipt was proof. Proof they had been warned. Brenda's response was predictable and foolish. The notice on the bulletin board was torn down within hours. The next HOA newsletter, which came out that Friday, was almost entirely dedicated to the fence issue. Brenda wrote a long, rambling president's message, a masterpiece of performative victimhood and righteous indignation. Our community is under attack, it began. A selfish landowner who enjoys the benefits of our well-maintained neighborhood without contributing to it has taken aggressive action to cut us off from our traditional lands. He has resorted to threats and intimidation, attempting to scare us with legal-sounding nonsense. But we will not be bullied. The board stands united. We have consulted with our legal counsel, and they have assured us that our rights to the historic equestrian trail are ironclad under the doctrine of prescriptive easement. We will be taking forceful legal action to affirm our rights. She had no idea what a gift she had just given me. We have consulted with our legal counsel. That was a specific, factual claim, a claim I could verify, and forceful legal action. She was promising a lawsuit. She was putting it in writing, distributed to over 100 homeowners. I printed the newsletter and added it to the folder. Now it was time to move from defense to offense. Not with a sledgehammer, but with a search engine and a telephone. I retreated to my home office. It's a small room, lined with books on land law, water rights, and veterinary science. It smells of old paper and leather. It is my sanctuary of order. I sat down at my desk, the folder open before me, and began to work the problem as if it were a complex livestock theft case. First, the HOA's lawyer. Brenda had claimed they had consulted him. The HOA's legal counsel was a firm named Dawson, Pike and Associates, a small outfit in the city that specialized in HOA management law. I knew a guy, a paralegal named Ben, who used to work there before he went to a bigger firm. I called him. "Ben, it's Arthur Penhaligon," I said. "I have a question for you about your old bosses." "Arthur, good to hear from you. Hope you're not in any trouble," he said. "Not yet," I said. "Tell me, what was Dawson's standard advice on prescriptive easements?" Ben laughed. "Oh, that's easy. Don't touch them with a 10-foot pole. He always said they were expensive to litigate, almost impossible to win against a non-consenting landowner, and a huge liability for the HOA. His advice was always to negotiate a formal, purchased easement, or drop it." "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," I said. "Thanks, Ben. I owe you a beer." "Any time, Arthur." So, either Brenda was lying about consulting the lawyer, or she had consulted him, and was lying about what he had said. Both were actionable. I made a note of my conversation with Ben, including the date and time. It was hearsay, but it was a guidepost. It told me where to dig. Next, I went online to the county court records portal. I searched for lawsuits filed by the Meadows at Sagebrush Point HOA. There were dozens over the years, mostly for collecting unpaid dues. But then I found something interesting. A lawsuit from 4 years prior. Meadows at Sagebrush Point HOA versus Henderson. Mr. Henderson, the retired teacher. The case was about his woodpile. The HOA had sued him to force its removal. I read the case summary. The HOA had lost. The judge had ruled that the CC and RS were vaguely worded and that the HOA had not acted in good faith. More importantly, the judge had ordered the HOA to pay Mr. Henderson's legal fees. The HOA had appealed and lost again. Brenda had never mentioned this in any newsletter. She had presented her authority as absolute and her judgment as infallible. But here, in the public record, was proof of her fallibility. proof that she could be beaten. Proof that her interpretation of the rules had already been rejected by a court of law. I downloaded the full case file, all 47 pages of it, and printed it out. It went into the folder. Now for the bombshell, the piece of evidence that would change the nature of the conflict. It came from a place I hadn't expected. It came from my old job. As part of my quiet war, I had started paying more attention to Brenda's prized horse. Her name was Duchess, a beautiful chestnut mare that Brenda paraded around the neighborhood. Duchess was the living symbol of the equestrian lifestyle Brenda was selling. She was the reason the trail was so important. In her newsletter, Brenda often referred to Duchess as her champion barrel racer. Out of professional habit, I had taken a few pictures of Duchess one afternoon when Brenda was riding her near my property line. I zoomed in on the horse's left flank. There it was, faint but clear under the summer coat, a brand. It was a simple design, a lazy J over a bar. Every brand in this state is registered. It's a public database. I logged into the Department of Agriculture's brand registry portal, a system I had helped design a decade ago. I searched for the owner of the Lazy J over bar. The result came back instantly. The brand was registered to a corporation, Red Rock Cattle Company, and their address wasn't in this county, it was in Arizona. My heart started to beat a little faster. This was the moment in an investigation where the thread you've been pulling on suddenly goes taut. A brand is title. If Brenda didn't own the brand, she had to have a bill of sale from the person who did. It was possible, of course. She could have bought the horse, but something felt wrong. Brenda's entire persona was built on a foundation of manufactured reality. What if her horse, the very symbol of her authority, was part of that fiction? I made a phone call. It was to an old colleague of mine, a brand inspector in the district covering the Arizona border. His name was Frank. "Frank, it's Arthur," I said. "Arthur, you old dog. I thought you were retired, sitting on your porch drinking whiskey." "The whiskey is for later," I said. "I need a favor. I need you to run a check on a brand, Lazy J over bar, registered to Red Rock Cattle Company." "Red Rock? Yeah, I know them. Big outfit down by Kingman. What about them?" "I need to know if they've reported any horses stolen in the last few years. Specifically a chestnut mare, about 10 years old now." Frank was quiet for a moment. "That's an official inquiry, Arthur. You're not on the books anymore." "I know, Frank. This is personal, but it might become official. Let's just say I've run into a woman who has a habit of claiming things that don't belong to her. Land, rights, and maybe, just maybe, a horse." I could hear him typing in the background. "Okay, Arthur, I'm looking. Red Rock. Yeah, they had a break-in about 5 years ago. Tack room was cleaned out. They also reported one horse missing, a 4-year-old chestnut filly. Her name was JJ's Surprise. Never recovered. The case is still open, but cold as ice." "Why?" My blood ran cold. "Frank," I said slowly, "send me the case file, the full report, everything you have, unofficially for now." "Arthur, what have you gotten yourself into?" I said, looking at the growing stack of paper on my desk. "I'm about to close a very cold case." The file from Frank arrived 2 days later, via a secure email portal. It contained the original police report, the supplemental report from the Arizona brand inspector, and photographs of the missing filly. It also contained a copy of her registration papers with the American Quarter Horse Association. The registered name was JJ's Surprise. Her sire and dam were listed, her date of birth, and a detailed description, right down to a small white star on her forehead and a scar on her right hind pastern. That evening, I took my binoculars and sat on my back porch. I waited. Just before sunset, Brenda came out to lead Duchess from her small paddock to her stall. As the horse turned, the setting sun glinted off her face. There it was, a small white star. And as she walked, I saw it. A faint, thin, white line of scarred tissue on her right hind leg, just above the hoof. She had no idea. She was parading a stolen horse in front of a retired brand inspector for 2 years. The sheer, monumental arrogance of it was breathtaking. I printed the entire Arizona case file and added it to my folder. The folder was no longer just about a civil dispute over a fence line. It was about a felony. It was no longer just heavy. It was loaded. The next move came from her, as I knew it would. A knock on my door a week later. It wasn't Brenda. It was a sheriff's deputy. He was young, professional, and looked deeply uncomfortable. "Arthur Penhaligon?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Sir, I'm Deputy Miller. I'm here because we received a call from a Ms. Brenda Clark. She's alleging that you've been threatening and harassing her." I had been expecting this. It was the classic escalation of the performative tyrant. When facts fail, play the victim. "Threatening her how?" I asked calmly. "She says you've been spying on her with binoculars, that you sent her a threatening letter, and that you're trying to restrict her access to her horse," the deputy said, reading from his notepad. He looked up at me. "She's over there now, on the road. She wants to file a formal complaint." I could see her, 100 yards away, standing next to her luxury SUV, arms crossed, tapping her foot. She was putting on a show for the deputy, for the neighborhood. "Deputy," I said, "may I see your badge number?" He was taken aback. Sure, it's 4815. "Thank you, Deputy Miller. Badge number 4815. Please note for your report that I am now activating the body camera on my personal cell phone." I held up my phone, its red light blinking. "I would like to state for the record that I have never threatened Miss Clark. I did send a registered letter to the HOA board, of which she is president, informing them they were not to trespass on my private property. As for the binoculars, I am an avid bird watcher. My property abuts hers. It is not illegal to look at birds, or at a horse for that matter." The deputy blinked. He was used to yelling and denial, not calm, procedural statements. "Okay, sir, noted. Furthermore," I said, "I have reason to believe Miss Clark's complaint is being made in bad faith, as retaliation for my refusal to allow her and her associates to trespass on my land. I have video evidence of Ms. Clark attempting to destroy my fence just last week. Would you like to see it?" The deputy's eyes widened slightly. "You have video?" "I do," I said. "But I would prefer to show it to your supervisor, or perhaps in a court of law. For now, I just want your report to accurately reflect that her claims are disputed, and that I am formally alleging that she is filing a false police report." I handed him my driver's license and a copy of the trespass notice I had sent to the HOA. I didn't give him anything from the folder. Not yet. This was just about creating another layer of official documentation. The deputy looked from my ID to the notice, then back at me. He looked over at Brenda, who was now pacing dramatically by her car. A subtle shift occurred in his posture. He was no longer just a messenger. He was a witness. He saw the difference between her performance and my quiet presentation of facts. "Okay, Mr. Penhaligon," he said, handing my documents back. "I've got your statement. We'll put it in the report. Officially, this is a civil matter unless she can prove a direct threat." "I understand," I said. "Thank you for your professionalism, Deputy." He nodded, a flicker of what looked like respect in his eyes, and walked back to his patrol car. He spoke with Brenda for another 10 minutes. I could see her gesticulating wildly, pointing at my house, at her horse, at the sky. The deputy just stood there, notepad in hand, occasionally nodding. Finally, he got in his car and drove away. Brenda stood alone on the road, her audience gone. She looked smaller, weaker. I went back inside and made a new entry in my log. August 22, 11:30 a.m. Visit from Deputy Miller, badge 4815. Filed verbal statement disputing Brenda Clark's harassment claim and alleged filing of a false police report. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line and requested a copy of the incident report. Another piece of paper for the folder. The folder was almost ready, but it was missing one thing: a human element. So far, it was just my word against hers, supported by a mountain of paper. I needed a voice from inside her own kingdom. That voice came to me 2 days later, in the form of a tentative knock on my door, just after dusk. It was Mr. Henderson. He was holding a shoebox. "Arthur," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Can I come in?" "Of course, George," I said, leading him to the kitchen table. He looked haunted. "I saw the deputy at your house. I saw the notice you put up at the clubhouse before she tore it down. Are you really fighting her?" "I'm not fighting her, George," I said. "I'm presenting her with the facts. There's a difference." He sat down and pushed the shoebox across the table. "I heard what she's saying, that you're a dangerous man, that you're threatening her. I know it's not true. She's the dangerous one." He tapped the box. "I've been going to those HOA meetings for years. After she sued me over the woodpile, my wife bought me a little digital recorder. Told me to record every meeting just in case. I did." I opened the shoebox. It was full of cassette tapes and small, cheap digital audio recorders. Each one was labeled with a date. "There's a meeting in there from 3 months ago," George said, his voice trembling slightly. "It was an executive session, just the board. She thought I'd left, but I was in the restroom. The door was ajar. I heard everything. She was talking about you, about the easement. The HOA lawyer, Mr. Dawson, was on speakerphone. He told her clear as day that she had no claim. He told her a lawsuit would be legal malpractice and that the HOA would lose and be on the hook for your legal fees. He told her to drop it." I stared at the shoebox. This was it. This was the linchpin. My conversation with the paralegal was hearsay. This was a recording. This was irrefutable proof that Brenda had knowingly lied to the entire community in her newsletter. She hadn't just ignored legal advice. She had acted in direct opposition to it, and then claimed the opposite. "And that's not all," George said. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was an email. "Someone on the board is getting sick of her. They forwarded this to me. It's from Brenda to the other board members, from the day after the lawyer told her no." I unfolded the paper and read it. "Dawson is a coward," it said. "He doesn't understand the spirit of our community. We will proceed with or without his blessing. The cost of inaction is far greater than the risk of a lawsuit. We will teach Mr. Penhaligon a lesson in what it means to be a neighbor. Do not discuss Dawson's opinion outside of this board." I looked at George, the fearful ally. He had been a victim for years, but he had done what I had done. He had kept the receipts. "George," I said, my voice thick with a gratitude I rarely felt, "you have no idea what you've just done." "I just want it to stop, Arthur," he said quietly. "I just want to be left alone." "I think we can arrange that," I said, placing the email and the shoebox next to my folder. The coalition was forming. First George, the fearful ally. Then came the disillusioned insider. The email George had given me was anonymous, but it told me there was a crack in Brenda's wall of power. 2 days later I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Mr. Penhaligon?" a woman's voice asked. "It is." "My name is Carol. I'm on the HOA board." She sounded nervous. "I'm the one who sent George Henderson the email. I can't stand what Brenda is doing anymore. She's going to ruin this community. She's running it like a dictator, and she's lying to everyone." "I'm aware," I said. "Thank you for what you did, Carol." "She's planning something," Carol said, her voice dropping. "She's furious about the sheriff's deputy not arresting you. She had an emergency board meeting last night. She wants to file a temporary restraining order against you, a TRO. She's going to claim you're a threat to her personal safety and the safety of her horse. She's going to a judge tomorrow morning, a TRO. A brilliant, desperate, and catastrophically stupid move. A TRO would require a court hearing. It would force us both into a formal setting, in front of a judge, under oath. She was, in her rage, delivering the exact venue I needed to present my case. She was sharpening the blade for her own execution. "Carol," I said, "would you be willing to testify to what you know? About the lawyer's advice? About Brenda's behavior?" There was a long pause. "Yes," she finally said, her voice firm. "Yes, I would. This has gone on long enough." "Then I suggest you have your testimony ready," I said, "because I believe our day in court is coming very soon." It came the very next day. A different sheriff's deputy, this one looking grim and apologetic, served me with the papers at 8 a.m. I was ordered to appear in county court the following morning at 9 a.m. for an emergency hearing on a petition for a temporary restraining order. The order, signed ex parte by a judge based solely on Brenda's sworn declaration, required me to stay 500 feet away from her house and her horse, pending the hearing. Her declaration was a work of fiction worthy of a prize. It painted me as a menacing recluse, peering from my windows, muttering threats, and engaging in a campaign of terror. It mentioned my unexplained and threatening surveillance with binoculars. It claimed my fence was an act of malicious aggression. It was filled with words like fear, endangerment, and unstable. She had sworn to it, under penalty of perjury. I read the entire document, then placed it carefully on top of the stack of papers inside my now bulging manila folder. I picked up the phone and called the only lawyer I had ever trusted, a man who specialized in agricultural law and property disputes. "Robert," I said, "it's Arthur Penhaligon. I need you in court tomorrow morning at 9, and I'm bringing my files." The courtroom was small and smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. It was a place for divorces, small claims, and the petty dramas of everyday life. Brenda was already there, sitting at the plaintiff's table, with a prim, self-satisfied look on her face. She was dressed in a conservative navy blue suit, the picture of a respectable community leader, under siege. Behind her in the gallery sat a half-dozen of her supporters from the HOA, a claque of nodding, sympathetic faces. She was performing for them, for the judge, for the world. I sat at the defendant's table with my lawyer, Robert. Robert was a man in his 60s, like me, with a calm demeanor and eyes that had seen everything. He had my folder on the table in front of him. It was 2 inches thick. He had spent the previous evening reading every page. When he was done around midnight, he had called me. All he said was, "Oh, Arthur, this is beautiful." Also in the gallery, sitting on the opposite side from Brenda's supporters, were Mr. Henderson and Carol. They both gave me a small, nervous nod. They were the counter-narrative. The judge, a woman named Esposito, who had a reputation for being sharp and impatient, entered the room. "Be seated," she said, her voice cutting through the low murmur. She looked down at the case file. "In the matter of Clark versus Penhaligon, petition for a temporary restraining order. Miss Clark, you are the petitioner. Please explain to me why I should grant this order." Brenda stood up. She had a tissue in her hand, and her voice trembled from the first word. It was a masterful performance. "Your Honor," she began, "I am here today because I am afraid. I am afraid for my safety, for my family's safety, and for the safety of my animals." She launched into her story. She painted a picture of me as a hostile, angry neighbor, furious about her community leadership. She described my constant surveillance, my threatening letters, the aggressive fence I had built. She talked about the historic equestrian trail, as if it were a registered national landmark she was sworn to protect. "He is trying to isolate us, Your Honor," she said, her voice cracking, "to intimidate me into silence. I am just a volunteer, trying to protect my community, and he is a man with a grudge. When I tried to restore the community's rightful access, he came out of his house and threatened me. I am afraid of what he will do next. All I ask is for the court's protection, for him to leave me and my horse alone." She dabbed her eyes with the tissue and sat down. Her supporters murmured in sympathy. Judge Esposito looked at her, her face unreadable. Then she turned to us. "Mr. Penhaligon, your response." Robert stood up slowly. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm and even. "My client is a 68-year-old widower and a respected retired state official who has lived peacefully on his property for 40 years. The petitioner, Miss Clark, is the president of a neighboring HOA that has been engaged in a campaign of harassment against my client for years." "Objection!" Brenda's lawyer, a young man who looked flustered, piped up. That's not relevant to the TRO. Overruled, the judge snapped. I'll be the judge of what's relevant. Continue, counsel. Robert nodded. Your Honor, we will show that every single claim made in Ms. Clark's declaration is either a gross misrepresentation or an outright lie, and that this petition is not about fear, but about retaliation. It is an abuse of the court system to achieve a real estate objective she could not achieve legally. The judge leaned forward, interested. Strong words. Counsel. Back them up. With pleasure, Your Honor, Robert said. He reached into the folder. Let's start with the so-called Historic Equestrian Trail. Petitioner's Exhibit A is a hand-drawn map included in her declaration. I'd like to present Defendant's Exhibit A. He pulled out the high-resolution, certified copy of the county plat map and placed it on the projector. This is the official survey map of my client's property, on file with the county since 1978. As you can see, the property line is clearly marked, and there is no easement. None. The trail Ms. Clark refers to does not exist on paper. The judge stared at the map. Ms. Clark, she said without looking away from the screen. Is this map accurate? Brenda stammered. Well, yes, but historic use. Next, Robert said, cutting her off. Ms. Clark claims my client threatened her. In fact, my client video recorded the entire encounter. We have it here on a thumb drive. It shows Ms. Clark on my client's property, attempting to destroy a fence, and threatening my client with illegal fines and foreclosure. My client says almost nothing. Robert handed the thumb drive to the bailiff. The judge watched the short video on her monitor, her expression growing tighter and tighter. When it was over, she looked at Brenda. The look was cold. Ms. Clark, the judge said, her voice dangerously quiet. In the video, you threatened to put a lien on Mr. Penhaligon's property. Is he a member of your HOA? No, but... Then on what legal grounds did you believe you could place a lien on his property? The board approved it, Brenda said, her voice defensive. Which brings us to the board, Robert said smoothly. In the HOA newsletter distributed to all members, Ms. Clark stated, and I quote, "We have consulted with our legal counsel, and they have assured us that our rights to the historic equestrian trail are ironclad. Defendant's Exhibit C." He placed the newsletter on the projector. Your Honor, we have a witness who can testify about that legal advice. Robert called Carol to the stand. Carol, nervous but resolute, recounted the story of the board meeting, the speakerphone call with the lawyer, the lawyer's explicit advice that the HOA had no case and should drop the matter. Then Robert showed her the email. Is this the email Ms. Clark sent to the board after that call? Yes, Carol said. She told us to ignore our lawyer. The judge read the email on her screen. So, Ms. Clark, she said, her voice like chipping ice. You received legal advice telling you that you had no claim, and you not only ignored it, you lied to your entire community and told them the lawyer had said the exact opposite. Is that correct? Brenda was white as a sheet. He didn't understand the context, she whispered. I understand the context of perjury, Ms. Clark, the judge said, and you are getting dangerously close to it. The collapse was beginning. The mask of the confident wrong leader was cracking, and the panicked, deceitful bully underneath was becoming visible. Her supporters in the gallery were no longer nodding. They were staring, expressions of confusion and betrayal on their faces. And finally, Your Honor, Robert said, his voice dropping for dramatic effect. There is the matter of the horse. Brenda flinched. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but I saw it, and I think the judge saw it too. The petitioner claims she is afraid for the safety of her prize-winning horse, Duchess, Robert said. My client, Mr. Penhaligon, has a certain professional expertise in this area. For 35 years, he was a senior livestock brand inspector for the state. His job was to identify and recover stolen livestock. A gasp went through the courtroom. Brenda stared at me, her eyes wide with a dawning, sickening horror. The blood drained from her face. She finally, in that one terrible moment, understood who she had been dealing with. She understood that the quiet old man she had dismissed as a feeble recluse had been observing her with the trained eye of a detective. Robert let the silence hang in the air for a long moment. Then he pulled the last set of documents from the folder. Your Honor, this is Defendant's Exhibit E. It is a certified copy of the brand registration for the Lazy J over bar brand, visible on the petitioner's horse. The brand is registered to the Red Rock Cattle Company in Arizona. It is not registered to Brenda Clark. He then placed the next document on the projector. This is Defendant's Exhibit F. It is the official cold case file from the Mojave County Sheriff's Office in Arizona regarding a horse named JJ's Surprise, reported stolen 5 years ago. The report includes photographs. It includes a description of the horse, down to a white star on her forehead and a scar on her right hind pastern. Robert walked over to me and took the binoculars from my briefcase. My client, using these binoculars which Ms. Clark claims were for threatening surveillance, was able to confirm that her horse Duchess bears these exact markings. Your Honor, the petitioner is not just abusing the court's time with a frivolous TRO, she is, to a high degree of certainty, in possession of stolen property, a felony. The room was utterly silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the courthouse ventilation. Brenda Clark sat frozen at her table, her face a blank mask of shock. The performance was over. The audience was gone. There was only the stark, undeniable reality of the documents on the screen. She had built her entire world on a series of confident lies, and it had just been dismantled, piece by piece, by a quiet man with a folder full of paper. She didn't look at the judge. She didn't look at her lawyer. She just stared at me, her expression a mixture of pure hatred and dawning terror. She had no idea, and now she did. Judge Esposito slowly took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. She let the silence stretch, a tangible weight in the room. She looked at the documents on the projector screen, then at the pale, frozen figure of Brenda Clark, and finally at me. Miss Clark, the judge said, her voice devoid of all emotion, do you have anything to say in response to this information? Brenda's lawyer, who looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, leaned over and whispered frantically in her ear. She shook her head, a tiny spastic movement. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. I see, the judge said. In my 10 years on this bench, I have seen my share of frivolous petitions. I have seen neighbors squabble over hedges and dogs. But I do not believe I have ever seen such a malicious, calculated, and fraudulent abuse of this court's protective orders. The petition for a temporary restraining order is denied with extreme prejudice. She slammed her gavel down once. The sound was like a gunshot. Furthermore, she continued, her eyes locked on Brenda, you have filed a sworn declaration with this court that appears to be filled with perjurious statements. You have admitted to ignoring the advice of your own legal counsel, and then lying about that advice to your constituents, in what seems to be a deliberate attempt to manufacture a pretext for this confrontation. And now there is credible documented evidence before me, suggesting you are in possession of a stolen animal, a felony in this state. The judge turned to her bailiff. Bailiff, please provide a copy of the last 3 exhibits and the court transcript to the district attorney's office for review of potential charges of perjury and the filing of a false police report. And contact the State Brand Board. Inform them of this hearing and have them send an investigator to secure the animal in question. Pending a full ownership investigation. Miss Clark, you are not to move, sell, or transport the horse known as Duchess until that investigation is complete. She then looked at Robert. Counsel, you will submit a motion for all legal fees incurred by your client in defending against this action. I am inclined to grant it in full and to award punitive damages. This court does not appreciate being used as a weapon in a neighborhood squabble. Brenda finally broke. A choked, guttural sob escaped her lips. The sound was not of sadness, but of utter, complete defeat. Her supporters in the gallery were already slipping out the side door, their faces averted, not wanting to be associated with the public implosion of their queen. "We are adjourned," the judge said, and swept out of the courtroom. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within a week, the story was all over the small-town local news. HOA president accused of perjury, horse theft. The state brand inspector, a young man I had trained a decade earlier, confirmed the identity of JJ's surprise. The rightful owners from Red Rock Cattle Company, an elderly couple, drove up from Arizona. There was a tearful reunion with their long-lost horse right in the paddock behind Brenda's house. With news cameras rolling, they changed her name back to JJ. Brenda was arrested and charged with felony possession of stolen property, perjury, and filing a false police report. She made bail, but her world had crumbled. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting. Carol, now emboldened, presented the evidence of Brenda's lies and financial mismanagement. A vote of no confidence was passed unanimously. Brenda was recalled as president, and Carol was elected in her place. The financial consequences were just as severe. The judge, true to her word, ordered Brenda to pay every cent of my legal fees, which came to just over $10,000. She was also hit with $5,000 in punitive damages, which I quietly donated to the county's large animal shelter. The HOA's insurance carrier, upon learning that Brenda had acted against the explicit advice of their legal counsel, denied her claim for coverage, leaving her personally liable for everything. The community began to heal. One of Carol's first acts as the new HOA president was to call a special meeting to rescind every fine Brenda had issued over the past 2 years. That wasn't for a clear, unambiguous violation of the CC&Hs. Mr. Henderson got a check in the mail refunding him for the unaesthetic woodpile fine from years ago, with interest. The Patels were sent a formal letter of apology. The atmosphere in the Meadows subdivision changed. The tension, the feeling of being watched and judged, dissipated. People started talking to each other again. Mr. Henderson came by my house a few weeks later. He wasn't whispering this time. He had a bottle of good whiskey in his hand. We sat on my porch, watching the sun set behind the ridges. "You know, Arthur," he said, "for years I was afraid of her. We all were. We just wanted to be left alone, so we let it happen." "I understand," I said. "But you weren't afraid," he said. "Why?" I thought about that for a moment, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. "I wasn't afraid of her," I said. "I was afraid of what she represented. Disorder. The idea that rules don't matter if you're loud enough. The idea that what is written on paper can be erased by shouting. My whole life has been about the principle that ownership is a fact, not an opinion. The brand on a cow, the deed to a piece of land, they're quiet things, but they're supposed to be solid, unchanging. When someone like Brenda comes along and tries to replace that with noise and intimidation, it's like a disease. It breaks down the foundations of things. I wasn't fighting her. I was defending the foundation." He nodded slowly, understanding. "You kept the receipts." "I kept the receipts," I agreed. In the end, Brenda took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of misdemeanor possession of stolen property and was given 2 years of probation and a hefty fine. The perjury charge was dropped in exchange for her testimony against the man who had actually stolen the horse and sold it to her with forged papers. The last I heard, she and her husband had sold their house at a loss and moved out of state. The navy blue suit and the performative tears were gone, replaced by the quiet humiliation of a U-Haul truck. Life on my small ranch returned to its quiet rhythm. The new fence stands strong and true, a clear and definite line. The space where Brenda drove her T-post into my land is now covered with fresh grass. Sometimes, the new neighbors from the meadows, the ones who ride horses, call me on the phone. They ask permission to cross the corner of my pasture to get to the state land. I always say yes. It's a handshake agreement, a neighborly kindness. It is permissive. It establishes nothing but goodwill. My folder is back in the bottom drawer of my desk. It is thicker now, with copies of court orders and newspaper clippings. It is a closed case. Sometimes when the house is especially quiet, I take it out and look at it. It is not a trophy. It is a reminder. A reminder that peace is not a passive state. Sometimes it must be actively, methodically, and relentlessly defended. It is a testament to the fact that in a battle between a loud lie and a quiet fact, the fact will win, as long as someone is patient enough to keep the receipts, and as long as someone is willing to do the paperwork. I close the folder, put it away, and go back to my porch. The sun is setting. The cattle are grazing peacefully, and the boundary lines are clear. Order is restored, on paper and on the land. And that, I've found, is a kind of justice you can build a life on.